Now it's my honor to welcome Vicente, my good friend here, who had a wealth of experience working on this very important topic from the economic and the data side, in OECD countries, but also in developing countries. I recall some experiences we had in Ethiopia. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your latest development and advice, what you should do to advance this topic in Africa. I know we worked a lot on the platform, and this could be something we can take forward and also harness some ideas here. So Vicente Ruiz, who is an economist at OECD, will share his thoughts on the OECD approach to this important topic. Vicente, you have the floor, sir.
Peter, Remy, everyone around the table, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. As Remy said, in the OECD Development Center, actually in partner with UN Habitat, we've been working very closely to try to better understand the role of intermediary cities in developing countries. So for the past few years, this has been a critical area of work for us. And since 2020, along with UN Habitat, we started a new adventure, let's say. And we questioned ourselves about the importance of intermediary cities and climate change. So for the past couple of years, we've been working to try to better understand the different connections that are very complex, of course. And we produced a report that we finished last year that will be launched in the next few months. And I will try to do in a very short time to give you some key messages about that came out from this report. Of course, the report is more than 200 pages, so I cannot dwell on everything that it's critical, but I'll do my best to answer some critical questions. For some reasons, I cannot share my slides, so it'd be great if Grace, you could, or Il, you could just do it for me. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the first question we wanted to answer, that we actually questioned ourselves, was why intermediary cities matter, why intermediary cities in developing countries matter for climate change. As has been extensively discussed today, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this, we all know that they play a very important role in the urbanization process of developing countries, but something that has come up very clear in our analysis is that these are very dynamic agglomerations, meaning that in many cases they're growing very fast, faster than bigger cities, and not just in terms of population, but also they're expanding faster. But they are very heterogeneous. And what I'm trying to say by heterogeneous is that it's very hard to come up with a simple narrative about intermediary cities because they are very different. Even within the same country, we see all sort of patterns of growth patterns. And I come back to this because this has important implications in terms of policy. I'll come back to this at the end. But when it comes to climate change, along with these dynamics, some of the structural characteristics of these cities make them very, very, very sensitive, very vulnerable to climate change. As was discussed also earlier today, many of these cities have a weak governance capacity. Human capacity sometimes is not necessarily low, but it sometimes doesn't stay, which makes it harder to accumulate knowledge. But more than this, in the case of intermediary city, the strong connection to rural areas sometimes makes them more exposed to the shocks of climate change that are taking actually place in rural areas. And what we also learn from our analysis is that it's not just they're not just going to play an important role in terms of adaptation, but also in terms of mitigation efforts, they will have a very important role to play in the next decades. So I'll try to go through these 3 points basically. So if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So how climate change is affecting the cities? Not surprisingly, it's affecting cities independently of their size. We try to separate the effects of climate change in intermediary cities by looking at direct effects and indirect effects. The direct effects are the ones that you know very well. that heat waves, water stress, drought, flooding, storms, you call it. Those shocks that affect cities independently of the site or the function. However, the indirect effects are particularly relevant for intermediary cities because these effects happen, especially sometimes in rural areas, but they kind of translate to intermediary cities. The effects accumulate across the rural-urban continuum and impacts intermediary cities. Not surprisingly, these follow the critical challenge, the two main challenges, connecting urban and rural areas, which is food, goods, and people. So what we observe is that there's a disruption in food system and increasingly climate-induced migration. And I'll go back to these 2 points in a future slide. Can you move to the next slide, please? So I'm not going to discuss in detail all the direct effects that we analyze in the report because there are lots and we don't have the time. But just to tell you what I mean by this, basically, what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand if climate shocks were affecting cities of different size in a different way. So I'm just going to show you the example of the analysis we did for flooding and storms. So on the left side of the graphic on the left side, I'm showing you the share of the population at risk of storm in coastal areas, by the way, and the share of built up at risk of flooding in cities close to rivers. Basically, just with the simple graphic, we can see that cities, smaller size cities, have a higher share of this population at risk. This can be explained by different reasons. Okay, before I keep on going, we are looking at cities in developing countries across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Again, we don't have the space to go in detail of the regions, but this is the overall picture. So what we observe is this gradient that shows that cities of a small size tend to be more exposed than larger cities. Again, this can be explained, but sometimes by having inadequate infrastructure, of growth patterns that have exposed certain new dwellings in areas with high risk, etc. So on the right side, we question ourselves, okay, so we look at this because this data is for 2015. But when we question ourselves about the evolution of these, how these things have changed in time, we wanted to analyze, for instance, an increasing build-up, how it has affected the area exposed to flooding within cities. So on the right side, you have the results of an econometric analysis analyzing more than 10,000 cities between 1990 and 2015. And without entering too much detail into the numbers, the message that I want you to keep is that the dots that you observe in these graphics are the impacts of increasing build-up on the area, on the percentage of flooding area, meaning that in bigger cities, increasing build-up has a bigger impact on the flooding area, right? So this is the type of analysis we did in order just to question ourselves about the shocks of climate change on cities. And I'll come back to this point again on the shocks on cities of different size. Can we move to the next slide, please? But as I mentioned before, intermediary cities, because this intermediary function they play, they're also exposed to shocks that take place across the rural-urban continuum. This is a very simplistic diagram that Drew may know very well, especially those that are familiar with the rural-urban literature, in which we wanted just to portray the different activities that take place across the rural-urban spectrum and how climate change is affecting these activities across the space. So basically, in a very, very simple way to put it, what we observe is that what happens in rural areas further affects what happens in urban areas and eventually affects intermediary cities. For instance, the shocks that we observe in rural areas are mainly linked to decrease in agricultural productivity, mainly climate shocks or changes basically in climatic conditions tend to reduce yields and reduce agricultural productivity. But this goes up through the value chain. But we observe, and this is something that we're starting to discover, that climate change is not just affecting rural areas in terms of productivity, but in higher parts of the value chain, for instance, there's been damage in infrastructure, which further disrupts food systems, and eventually they impact the decrease in productivity and the damages in infrastructure, for instance, can impact food security in intermediary cities. And this is true only just looking at this through the food system channel, but it also manifests through migration. And this is an area that we are investing more energy to better understand how climate change is affecting migration from rural to intermediary cities. And the results we have, they show that it does. It's very difficult to capture these effects because all the different things that promote migration between rural and urban. But overall, we do see evidence that climate change is affecting migration from rural to intermediary cities. Next, please. But as I mentioned before, I mean, when it comes to climate change, it doesn't matter only we're not only talking about adaptation, we're also talking about mitigation. And this is an area where intermediary cities are kind of lagging behind. What we observe in our analysis is that most intermediary cities are investing sometimes a limited budget to address issues linked to adaptation, basically because they have no choice, basically because they have to react to climate shocks. So most of the investment goes in that direction. However, when it comes to mitigation, they will play a very important role in the next decades. Why? Because what we observe is that as these cities grow, of course, as you can expect, the impact on CO2 emissions is going to increase. As these cities grow, just not in terms of population, but also in built-up, the contribution to CO2 is going to change. What I want to show in this graphic is something similar to what I shown in the flooding case. We analyzed through econometric analysis cities across time, and we wanted to see how changes in terms of their population, the GDP, and built-up impact CO2 emissions. And the results show that there are different contributions depending on the site. As you can expect, cities with lower GDP have a lower impact on CO2. The same thing with population. As population increases, the contribution to CO2 increases too. This is not the case of built-up, however. As cities grow, let's say, the contribution of expanding built-up to CO2 is lower. This could be to the fact that bigger cities tend to have higher levels of agglomeration and even a better provision of public services like public transport. So these can compensate some of the previous contribution to CO2. But these really raises the question about not thinking about intermediary cities as a static entities, but something that is going to be changing in time. So the message that we should take from here is that as these cities grow, the contribution to CO2 is going to increase. So this takes me to my last slide. So next slide, please. Thank you. So let me conclude very quickly with 4 points. The first point concerns about my very first message about the heterogeneity and the strong difference we find when we look at intermediary cities. In my opinion, this cannot be undermined. Why? Because this has really highlighted the importance of policies that are not space blind, meaning that policies that just focus on cities or even intermediary cities that just as if they were just one type of city or the median type of city, they're gonna miss the mark big time, because we see very different patterns even within a country when it comes to intermediary cities. As I mentioned before, the lessons we take from this report is that even if intermediary cities do not account for a big share of the contribution to CO2, they probably will in the next times. So we have to have a dynamic approach when it comes to intermediary cities, meaning that they are not always stay the same size. They're going to change. And this is exactly what I said about the dynamics. In many cases, they're changing very fast. So the mitigation policy is a very important and pending agenda that, especially in our work, we would like to address in the next few years. Along with UN Habitat, for instance, we will put in place some case studies to try to analyze how we can use a system approach to identify bottlenecks and ways in which intermediary cities can have a better mitigation policies. And let me just conclude with probably a positive message, that is that so far, as we said before also, intermediary cities have been seen as the underdog and usually overshadowed by big cities. But what we're starting to understand is that being small could be actually an opportunity, not having such a complex issues as big cities, not having such a big pie of stakeholders to deal with when we want to promote reforms can actually be an important asset for intermediary cities in the future. So I will conclude here. If you can move to the next slide, please. I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm afraid that I'm running super late for a meeting that I had at 3 p.m., so I could not stay any longer. But if you have any question or comment, please don't hesitate to reaching out to me. Many thanks to Remy and the team. Excellent job, and look forward to continue the discussion with you all.